Maria Santos had always been different from other women in her small village nestled in the mountains of Colombia. While her friends dreamed of marriage and children, she dreamed of becoming a soldier. Her father, a retired army sergeant, had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old. By 15, she could outrun most boys her age and climb trees faster than a monkey. Her mother worried constantly, but Maria's determination burned like fire in her chest. The year was 2019 when Maria finally convinced her parents to let her join the Colombian National Army. She was 21, strong as an ox and stubborn as a grandmother's old mule. The recruitment officer looked at her small frame and laughed, telling her the army wasn't a place for pretty girls who belonged in kitchens. Maria stared him down with eyes that could cut glass and said she would prove him wrong or die trying. Basic training nearly broke her. The other recruits, all men, made her life miserable. They hid her equipment, put salt in her water bottle, and whispered cruel jokes when she passed. But Maria never complained, never cried, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her weak. When Sergeant Rodriguez made them run 10 miles in full gear, Maria finished third out of 30 soldiers. When they had to carry wounded comrades across obstacle courses, Maria's partner was always the first to reach the finish line. 3 months into training, something changed. The men who had mocked her began asking for her help with marksmanship. Her steady hands and keen eye had earned their respect through countless hours on the shooting range. Maria could hit targets that seasoned soldiers missed. She could field strip and reassemble weapons faster than men who had been handling guns for years. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept her as one of their own. After graduation, Maria was assigned to the 4th Brigade in Medellin, one of the most dangerous postings in the country. Drug cartels controlled large sections of the surrounding jungle, and firefights were common. Her commanding officer, Captain Herrera, was initially skeptical about having a woman in his unit. He assigned her to communications and logistics, keeping her away from combat operations. Maria hated the desk work. While her fellow soldiers went on patrols and raids, she sat in the base organizing supply lists and monitoring radio chatter. She had not joined the army to push papers and make coffee for officers. Every night she requested transfer to active duty. Every morning, Captain Herrera denied her request with a shake of his head and a patronizing smile. The breakthrough came during a routine patrol that went horribly wrong. Corporal Martinez's squad had been ambushed near the village of San Rafael, deep in cartel territory. 2 soldiers were down, ammunition was running low, and reinforcements were hours away. The radio crackled with desperate calls for help as gunfire echoed in the background. Captain Herrera paced the command center, studying maps and barking orders at his staff. Maria listened to the chaos through her headset, her heart pounding as she tracked the squad's position on her computer screen. She knew that terrain better than anyone on the base. Her childhood summers had been spent hunting with her uncle in those same hills. She could navigate the jungle paths blindfolded and knew every creek, cave, and clearing for miles around. Without permission, Maria stood up from her desk and grabbed her rifle from the weapons locker. Captain Herrera spotted her heading toward the door and shouted for her to stop. She turned around, looked him straight in the eye, and told him that good soldiers were dying while he worried about regulations. Those men needed help, and she was the only person on the base who could reach them in time. The captain's face turned red with anger. He threatened to have her court-martialed for insubordination. Maria shouldered her weapon and replied that she would rather face a military tribunal than explain to Martinez's wife why her husband died because his commanding officer was too proud to let a woman save him. Before anyone could stop her, she ran out of the building and jumped into a jeep. The drive to San Rafael took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads. Maria's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she listened to the radio updates. The gunfire had intensified, and Corporal Martinez reported that Private Santos had been hit in the leg. They were pinned down behind a crashed truck with limited cover and dwindling ammunition. Maria parked her jeep 2 kilometers from the ambush site and continued on foot. The jungle was thick and humid, filled with the sounds of birds and insects. She moved quietly through the underbrush, using hunting techniques her uncle had taught her years before. Every shadow could hide an enemy sniper. Every rustling leaf could signal danger. She reached a ridge overlooking the ambush site and assessed the situation through her binoculars. Martinez's squad was trapped in a small clearing beside the main road. Their truck had flipped over after hitting an improvised explosive device, providing minimal protection from the crossfire. At least 8 cartel fighters surrounded them, firing from positions in the dense jungle. The soldiers were outnumbered and outgunned. Maria studied the enemy positions carefully, noting their locations and patterns of movement. She counted muzzle flashes and timed their rate of fire, building a mental map of the battlefield. The cartel fighters were confident, taking their time to pick off the trapped soldiers. They had no idea that help was coming from above. Moving silently along the ridge, Maria positioned herself behind a fallen tree that offered a clear field of fire. She adjusted her rifle scope and controlled her breathing, just as her father had taught her during those childhood hunting trips. The first shot had to count. If she missed, or only wounded her target, the entire enemy force would turn their attention toward her position. Through her scope, she watched a cartel fighter emerge from behind a large rock to reload his weapon. Maria centered the crosshairs on his chest and squeezed the trigger slowly. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man dropped instantly. His companion shouted in confusion, unsure where the shot had come from. Maria had already shifted position, moving 30 meters along the ridge before taking her second shot. Another cartel fighter fell, this time while trying to flank Martinez's position from the left. The remaining enemies began firing wildly into the jungle, spraying bullets at shadows and phantom threats. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The cartel fighters had expected to finish off a handful of trapped soldiers in a matter of minutes. Instead, their own numbers were being systematically reduced by an unseen enemy who seemed to strike from everywhere and nowhere. Panic spread through their ranks as they realized they were being hunted by a skilled marksman. Maria continued her deadly work, moving constantly to avoid detection. Each shot was precise and carefully planned. She targeted the enemy fighters who posed the greatest threat to the trapped soldiers below, neutralizing machine gunners and snipers first. Her childhood spent tracking deer and wild boar had prepared her for this moment, in ways no military manual could have taught. Within 20 minutes, she had eliminated 5 of the 8 attackers. The remaining 3 lost their nerve and began retreating deeper into the jungle. Maria could have pursued them, but her priority was reaching the wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. She slung her rifle across her back and began the treacherous descent toward the ambush site. The jungle slope was steep and slippery, covered with loose rocks and tangled vines. Maria moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that every second counted for the injured men below. Branches scraped against her uniform and thorns tore at her skin, but she pressed forward with single-minded determination. She reached the clearing just as Corporal Martinez was attempting to stop Private Santos's bleeding with a torn shirt. The young soldier had taken a bullet through his thigh, and blood was pooling beneath his leg. His face was pale and his breathing was shallow, classic signs of shock setting in. Martinez looked up in amazement as Maria emerged from the jungle. He had assumed their rescue had come from a full squad of reinforcements, not a single woman with a rifle. Maria immediately took charge of the medical situation, using her first aid training to apply a proper tourniquet to Santos's leg. The bleeding slowed considerably and some color returned to the wounded soldier's face. The other injured man, Private Reyes, had suffered a concussion when the truck exploded. He was conscious but disoriented, asking repeatedly where he was and what had happened. Maria checked his pupils for signs of serious brain injury while Martinez organized the other soldiers to secure the perimeter. Their position remained vulnerable despite Maria's successful counterattack. The 3 surviving cartel fighters could return with reinforcements at any time, and the crashed truck provided limited cover if they came under attack again. The radio was damaged in the explosion, making it impossible to call for medical evacuation or additional support. Maria made a difficult decision. Private Santos needed immediate surgery to save his leg, and Private Reyes required observation for potential brain trauma. They could not wait for help to arrive through official channels. She would have to evacuate the wounded soldiers herself using jungle paths that were too narrow and dangerous for military vehicles. Working together, the squad fashioned stretchers from fallen branches and torn equipment straps. Maria took point, leading the group through hidden trails that wound through the dense forest. The journey back to base would take several hours on foot, carrying 2 wounded men through treacherous terrain. The first part of their escape went smoothly. Maria's knowledge of the jungle proved invaluable as she guided them around impassable ravines and through narrow gaps between enormous trees. The wounded soldiers bore their pain with stoic determination, understanding that their survival depended on reaching medical care as quickly as possible. But their luck changed as they approached a river crossing 2 hours into the journey. Maria heard voices speaking in hushed Spanish, somewhere ahead on the trail. She signaled for the group to take cover behind a cluster of boulders while she moved forward to investigate. Through the trees, she could see four armed men examining footprints in the muddy riverbank. The cartel fighters had circled around and were tracking their retreat route. They had found the trail and were following it systematically, knowing that the soldiers would eventually have to cross the river at this narrow point. It was the perfect place for an ambush. With deep water on both sides and no alternative crossing points for miles in either direction, Maria crawled back to where Martinez and the others were hidden. She explained the situation in whispers, outlining their limited options. They could try to find another crossing point, but that would add hours to their journey and Private Santos might not survive the delay. They could wait for the cartel fighters to move on, but there was no guarantee they would leave anytime soon. The third option was the most dangerous but offered their best chance of survival. Maria would create a distraction upstream, drawing the enemy away from the crossing point while the others carried the wounded soldiers across the river. It was risky and would leave her isolated against superior numbers, but it was their only realistic hope. Martinez protested immediately, arguing that they should stick together and fight as a unit. Maria shook her head firmly, pointing out that their primary mission was getting the wounded men to safety. She was the fastest runner and best shot in the group, making her the logical choice for a diversion mission. Besides, she knew these jungle paths better than anyone else and had the best chance of escaping if things went wrong. Before anyone could argue further, Maria handed Martinez her spare ammunition and first aid supplies. She told him to wait exactly 15 minutes after hearing the first gunshot, then move quickly but carefully across the river. Once they reached the other side, they should continue toward the base without stopping or looking back, no matter what they heard behind them. Maria checked her rifle one final time and disappeared into the jungle like a ghost. She moved upstream for several hundred meters, positioning herself where the cartel fighters would be forced to expose themselves if they pursued her. The plan was simple in theory, but deadly dangerous in execution. She would engage the enemy long enough to pull them away from the river crossing, then withdraw deeper into the jungle while the others escaped. Hidden behind a massive cecropia tree, Maria watched the four gunmen through her rifle scope. They were still examining the riverbank, trying to determine exactly where the soldiers would attempt to cross. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, was pointing toward different sections of the river and giving instructions to his companions. Maria took careful aim and fired a single shot that struck the ground just inches from the scarred man's feet. The bullet sent up a spray of mud and water, causing all four men to dive for cover behind fallen logs and boulders. They began firing wildly in her direction, their muzzle flashes visible through the jungle gloom. She had achieved her objective of drawing their attention, but now came the dangerous part. Maria needed to keep them engaged long enough for Martinez's group to cross the river, while avoiding the concentrated firepower of four automatic weapons. She moved quickly to a new position, firing another carefully aimed shot that forced the enemies to relocate their own positions. The deadly game of cat and mouse continued for nearly 20 minutes. Maria would fire from one location, then move immediately to avoid the return fire that inevitably followed. The cartel fighters were skilled and experienced, but they were also frustrated and growing careless in their attempts to pin down their elusive target. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Maria heard splashing sounds from downstream that indicated Martinez's group had begun crossing the river. She needed to maintain the distraction for several more minutes to ensure they reached the other side safely. Loading a fresh magazine into her rifle, she prepared for the next phase of her desperate gamble. The scarred leader had apparently reached the same conclusion about the river crossing. He began shouting orders to his men, directing two of them to return downstream while he and the fourth fighter continued pursuing Maria. It was exactly what she had feared would happen, but there was nothing she could do to stop it without abandoning her concealed position. Maria made a split-second decision that would change the course of the entire engagement. Instead of continuing her defensive tactics, she went on the attack. Moving with the fluid grace of a jungle cat, she began stalking the two cartel fighters who were heading back toward the river. If they reached Martinez's group while the soldiers were vulnerable in the water, everyone would die. The chase through the dense undergrowth was like something from a nightmare. Maria had to move fast enough to intercept the gunmen before they reached the crossing, but quietly enough to avoid detection by their companions who were still searching for her upstream. Vines slapped at her face and thorns tore at her uniform as she ran through the jungle at full speed. She reached a small clearing just as the two cartel fighters emerged from the opposite side. Both men were breathing hard from their run through the forest, and their attention was focused on the sounds of splashing water they could hear somewhere ahead. They never saw Maria until she stepped out from behind a tree with her rifle raised. The first man died before he could bring his weapon to bear. Maria's bullet caught him center mass, dropping him instantly to the jungle floor. His companion managed to get off a wild burst from his submachine gun before Maria's second shot ended his life as well. The gunfire would certainly alert the remaining enemies to her location, but she had accomplished her mission of protecting the river crossing. Maria quickly searched the dead men for ammunition and intelligence, finding several loaded magazines and a handheld radio. Through the static, she could hear angry voices demanding to know what was happening at the river. The two remaining cartel fighters would be heading toward her position within minutes, drawn by the sounds of combat. She needed to disappear back into the jungle before they arrived. But first, she had to verify that Martinez's group had successfully completed their crossing. Moving carefully through the trees, Maria approached the riverbank and was relieved to see wet footprints leading up the opposite bank. The soldiers had made it across and were presumably continuing their journey toward the base. The sound of branches breaking behind her indicated that her pursuers were getting close. Maria shouldered her rifle and began moving downstream, leading the remaining enemies away from the route Martinez was taking. She would have to lose them in the jungle and then find her own way back to the base, assuming she could avoid being killed in the process. What followed was the most terrifying hour of Maria's life. The two cartel fighters were experienced trackers who knew the jungle almost as well as she did. They followed her sign through the forest with patient determination, forcing her to use every trick her uncle had taught her about moving unseen through the wilderness. Maria backtracked along stream beds to confuse her trail, climbed trees to avoid leaving footprints, and used thick vegetation to mask her scent. But her pursuers were relentless, and she could hear them getting closer with each passing minute. The scarred leader was shouting instructions to his companion, coordinating their search pattern to prevent her escape. Eventually, Maria realized that she would have to make a stand. She was getting tired from the constant movement, and night was beginning to fall. In the darkness, her pursuers would have all the advantages. They knew this area intimately, and probably had night vision equipment, while she would be operating blind in unfamiliar territory. Maria found a defensive position on a small hill overlooking a game trail that the cartel fighters would have to use if they continued tracking her. She had 2 full magazines of ammunition remaining, and enough water for several hours. If she could hold this position until dawn, she might be able to slip away when the light returned. The attack came just after sunset, when the jungle was filled with the sounds of nocturnal animals beginning their nightly activities. Maria heard movement in the bushes below and caught a glimpse of the scarred leader advancing carefully up the trail. She held her fire, waiting for a clear shot that would end the pursuit once and for all. But the cartel fighter was too experienced to present an easy target. He moved in short rushes from cover to cover, never exposing himself for more than a few seconds at a time. His companion was working around to Maria's left flank, trying to get behind her position while she was distracted by the frontal approach. Maria found herself caught in a classic pincer movement with enemies attacking from 2 directions simultaneously. She fired at muzzle flashes in the gathering darkness, but couldn't tell if her shots were having any effect. Return fire sparked off rocks near her head, forcing her to keep low behind her improvised fortifications. The battle continued through the night, with brief firefights separated by long periods of tense silence. Maria conserved her ammunition carefully, firing only when she had clear targets or needed to prevent the enemies from advancing too close to her position. Several times she heard one or both of her pursuers trying to work their way up the hill, but well-placed shots forced them back into the jungle. As dawn approached, Maria realized that her situation was becoming desperate. She was down to her last magazine of ammunition, and her water was nearly gone. The cartel fighters showed no signs of giving up their pursuit, and daylight would make her position even more vulnerable to attack. It was then that she heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction of the base. Captain Herrera had finally organized a proper search and rescue operation, and the aircraft were following the route Martinez's group would have taken back to safety. Maria fired 3 quick shots into the air, the universal distress signal that would alert the helicopter crews to her location. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as the aircraft changed course and began searching the area where her signal shots had originated. Within minutes, she could see the first helicopter through the jungle canopy, circling slowly as its crew looked for signs of survivors. The arrival of military aircraft changed the tactical situation completely. The two remaining cartel fighters realized they were now outnumbered and outgunned by a superior force that included air support. Maria heard them crashing through the undergrowth as they fled deeper into the jungle, abandoning their pursuit to save their own lives. The helicopter crew spotted Maria waving from her hilltop position and began looking for a place to land in the dense forest. The pilot eventually found a small clearing about 200 meters away and set the aircraft down carefully between the towering trees. Maria grabbed her rifle and ran toward the landing zone, hardly believing that her nightmare ordeal was finally coming to an end. Captain Herrera himself was aboard the rescue helicopter, along with a full squad of soldiers and a military medic. He helped Maria climb aboard the aircraft, his face showing a mixture of relief and amazement at finding her alive. As the helicopter lifted off and turned toward the base, he asked her to explain exactly what had happened during the ambush and rescue operation. Maria gave him a complete briefing during the flight back to Medellin, describing how she had eliminated 5 enemy fighters to save Martinez's squad and then led the evacuation through the jungle. She reported the locations where the gunfights had occurred and provided intelligence about cartel operations in the San Rafael area. Captain Herrera listened to her report with growing astonishment. He had never heard of a single soldier accomplishing so much against such overwhelming odds, especially someone who had been relegated to desk duty because of concerns about her gender. By the time they reached the base, his attitude toward Maria had changed completely. The story of Maria's heroism spread quickly through the brigade. Martinez and his men had already arrived safely and were telling everyone who would listen about how she had saved their lives. Private Santos was in surgery but was expected to make a full recovery, while Private Reyes had been treated for his concussion and was resting comfortably in the base hospital. Within a week, Maria's actions during the San Rafael ambush had been reported up the chain of command, all the way to Army headquarters in Bogotá. She was recommended for Colombia's highest military decoration for valor, and her story was featured in newspapers throughout the country. The woman who had been told that pretty girls belonged in kitchens had become a national hero overnight. 6 months after the San Rafael incident, Maria's life had changed beyond recognition. She was no longer the dismissed communications operator who pushed papers while men went to war. Colonel Vargas himself had transferred her to the elite Special Operations Unit, where she trained alongside the Army's most skilled soldiers. Her reputation as a marksman and tactical genius had spread throughout the Colombian military, earning her respect from officers who had once doubted that women belonged in combat roles. The Special Operations Compound was located in a heavily fortified section of the main base, surrounded by razor wire and guarded by sentries around the clock. Inside the perimeter, Maria trained with equipment and weapons that most regular soldiers never saw. She learned advanced marksmanship techniques, urban warfare tactics, and counter-terrorism procedures from instructors who had fought in conflicts around the world. Her teammates in the special unit were initially skeptical about having a woman in their ranks, despite her proven combat record. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a veteran of 20 years who had served in peacekeeping missions across Latin America, made it clear that he considered her inclusion a political decision, rather than a military necessity. Lieutenant Torres, the unit's explosives expert, frequently made jokes about protecting the pretty soldier during dangerous missions. Maria responded to their doubt the same way she had responded to every challenge throughout her military career. She worked harder than anyone else, stayed later during training sessions, and volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. During live-fire exercises, her accuracy with both rifle and pistol consistently outperformed soldiers with twice her experience. When the unit conducted grueling endurance tests in the jungle, Maria finished in the top 3 every time. Gradually, her performance began to change minds. Rodriguez stopped making comments about political correctness when Maria saved his life during a close-quarters combat simulation. Torres apologized for his earlier jokes after watching her successfully disarm an improvised explosive device during a training scenario that had stumped several other team members. The mission that would test Maria's skills to their absolute limit came in December 2019, during the height of the rainy season. Intelligence reports indicated that a major drug trafficking operation was being coordinated from a compound deep in the Amazon rainforest, near the border with Venezuela. The facility was reportedly being used to process coca leaves into pure cocaine, with shipments moving north toward the United States and Europe. What made this particular target so dangerous was its location and defenses. The compound was situated on an island in the middle of a fast-flowing river, accessible only by boat or helicopter. Satellite imagery showed concrete bunkers, guard towers, and what appeared to be surface-to-air missile installations, The cartel had learned from previous raids and had turned their processing facility into a fortress. Colonel Vargas called Maria into his office on a Monday morning when the rain was pounding against the windows like machine gun fire. He spread aerial photographs across his desk and began explaining the intelligence they had gathered about the target. The compound housed an estimated 50 cartel soldiers, many of them former military personnel from various South American countries. They were well-armed, well-trained, and willing to fight to the death to protect their operation. The mission would require a small team to infiltrate the island during the night, gather intelligence about the facility's defenses, and designate targets for an airstrike that would destroy the cocaine processing equipment. It was extremely dangerous work that required exceptional skill in reconnaissance, close-quarters combat, and survival in hostile territory. Colonel Vargas wanted Maria to serve as the team's primary sniper and intelligence gatherer. Maria studied the photographs carefully, noting the positions of guard towers and the likely patrol routes that enemy soldiers would use. The island was roughly 2 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, covered with dense jungle vegetation that would provide excellent concealment, but also make movement difficult. The river surrounding it was deep and fast-flowing, with strong currents that could easily sweep away anyone who fell into the water. The mission team consisted of 4 soldiers, each selected for specific skills that would be needed during the operation. Maria would provide sniper support and reconnaissance. Sergeant Rodriguez would handle communications and coordinate with air support. Lieutenant Torres would be responsible for explosives and demolition work. Captain Silva, a veteran Special Forces officer, would command the team and make tactical decisions during the operation. They spent 2 weeks planning every aspect of the mission, studying intelligence reports and rehearsing their infiltration procedures. The team would be inserted by helicopter at a landing zone 15 kilometers from the target, then move overland to a predetermined river crossing point. From there, they would use small inflatable boats to reach the island under cover of darkness. The weather on the night of the mission was perfect for their purposes, but terrible for human comfort. Heavy rain fell steadily from a black sky, reducing visibility to just a few meters and creating a constant din that would mask the sounds of their movement. The helicopter pilot had to navigate by instruments alone as he flew them through the storm toward their insertion point. Maria checked her equipment one final time as the aircraft approached the landing zone. She carried a sniper rifle equipped with night vision scope, a silenced pistol, and enough ammunition for an extended firefight. Her backpack contained communications equipment, medical supplies, and 3 days' worth of food and water. Everything was wrapped in waterproof materials to protect it from the relentless rain. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing and immediately lifted off again, leaving the 4 soldiers alone in the darkness of the Amazon night. They oriented themselves using GPS coordinates and began moving through the jungle toward their objective, maintaining radio silence and communicating only through hand signals. Progress through the rainforest was slow and exhausting. The ground was saturated with water, creating muddy conditions that made every step treacherous. Thick vegetation blocked their path at regular intervals, forcing them to use machetes to cut through vines and branches. The sounds of insects and nocturnal animals filled the air, providing natural camouflage for their movement, but also masking potential threats. After 4 hours of difficult travel, they reached the riverbank where their boats were hidden. The water was higher and faster than expected due to the heavy rains, creating dangerous currents that would make the crossing more difficult. Captain Silva studied the situation through night vision binoculars, trying to identify the safest route across to the target island. The crossing took nearly an hour as they fought against the powerful current while trying to remain silent and invisible. Maria's boat was nearly swept downstream when her paddle caught in a submerged branch, but Rodriguez managed to grab the bow line and help her regain control. They finally reached the island shore just before dawn, exhausted but relieved to have completed the most dangerous part of their approach. Once on dry land, the team moved quickly to establish a concealed observation post in dense jungle vegetation, about 500 meters from the main compound. From this position, they could monitor enemy activity while remaining hidden from patrol guards and lookouts. Maria set up her sniper rifle and began systematically cataloging the targets she could see through her scope. The cartel compound was larger and more sophisticated than their intelligence reports had indicated. In addition to the cocaine processing laboratories, she could see barracks buildings, vehicle maintenance facilities, and what appeared to be a communication center bristling with radio antennas. Armed guards walked regular patrols around the perimeter, and she counted at least 3 machine gun positions that would have to be neutralized during any assault. For 6 hours, Maria observed and documented enemy activity patterns. She noted the timing of guard changes, the routes used by patrol teams, and the locations of key personnel who appeared to be commanders or specialists. Her detailed observations would be crucial for planning the airstrike that would destroy the facility once the team was safely evacuated. The first sign of trouble came just after noon, when a patrol boat appeared on the river, carrying additional cartel soldiers toward the island. Maria watched through her scope as 8 heavily armed men disembarked at a dock near the main compound. Their leader, a tall man wearing expensive military equipment, was immediately met by someone who appeared to be the facility commander. Through her rifle scope, Maria could see the newcomers pointing toward the area where her team was hidden. Someone had spotted signs of their infiltration, possibly footprints on the muddy riverbank or broken vegetation where they had moved through the jungle. The cartel soldiers were organizing a systematic search of the island that would inevitably discover their observation post. Captain Silver made the difficult decision to abort the intelligence-gathering mission and extract immediately. The team had collected enough information to plan an effective airstrike, and staying longer would only risk capture or death. They began moving carefully toward their boats, hoping to reach the river before the enemy search parties found their hiding place. But their luck ran out just 500 meters from the water's edge. A patrol of 4 cartel soldiers appeared directly in their path, automatic weapons ready and obviously searching for intruders. There was no way to avoid contact, and no time for elaborate tactical maneuvers. The firefight began instantly, with both sides firing at point-blank range through the jungle undergrowth. Maria's first shot dropped the patrol leader before he could raise his rifle. Her second bullet caught another soldier in the chest as he tried to take cover behind a large tree. Rodriguez and Torres engaged the remaining enemies with submachine gun fire, while Captain Silva coordinated their withdrawal toward the river. The gunfire alerted the entire compound to their presence, and within minutes they could hear shouts and vehicle engines as reinforcements rushed toward their location. Maria provided covering fire as the team moved through the jungle, her precise shooting keeping pursuing enemies at bay while her teammates reached the boats. They launched their inflatable craft into the swirling river current just as the first enemy vehicles arrived at the shoreline. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the bank, sending bullets zipping across the water around their boats. Maria returned fire with her sniper rifle, targeting the muzzle flashes she could see among the trees, while Rodriguez called for immediate helicopter extraction. The river crossing became a running battle as cartel soldiers set up machine gun positions along the bank and began systematic fire at the escaping boats. Lieutenant Torres's craft took several hits and began losing air, forcing him to paddle desperately toward the opposite shore, as his boat slowly deflated beneath him. Maria's boat was struck by a burst of machine gun fire that shattered her paddle and punched holes through the inflatable sides. Water began pouring in as the craft lost buoyancy and started sinking in the middle of the fast-flowing river. She tried to plug the holes with her equipment pack, but there were too many punctures and the boat was going down rapidly. Captain Silva saw her predicament and tried to maneuver his boat closer, but the current was too strong and enemy fire too intense. Maria made the decision to abandon her sinking craft and swim for shore, knowing that staying with the boat would mean certain death when it went under completely. The river water was shockingly cold and moved with terrifying speed. Maria fought against the current while bullets splashed around her, trying to reach a section of the bank that wasn't controlled by enemy soldiers. Her equipment weighed her down, but she couldn't afford to abandon her rifle or communications gear that the team would need for extraction. She finally reached shore nearly a kilometer downstream from where her boat had sunk, exhausted and hypothermic but alive. The enemy soldiers were concentrated around the original crossing point, giving her a brief window to find concealment in the jungle vegetation. But she could hear search teams spreading out along the riverbank, shouting instructions and coordination, their hunt for survivors. Maria's situation was desperate. She was alone, cut off from her team, and surrounded by hostile forces in unfamiliar territory. Her radio had been damaged during the river crossing, making it impossible to contact Captain Silva or coordinate with the extraction helicopter. She would have to survive on her own until rescue arrived, assuming anyone knew where to look for her. The next several hours were a nightmare of constant movement and near detection. Cartel soldiers combed through the jungle systematically, calling out to each other as they searched every hiding place they could find. Maria used every technique she had learned about concealment and evasion, moving only when necessary and staying absolutely still when enemies passed close to her position. During one particularly close call, 3 soldiers stopped less than 10 meters from where she was hidden beneath a fallen log covered with thick vegetation. They discussed their search pattern in detail, mentioning that helicopters would soon arrive to help with the hunt. Maria held her breath and remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, until they finally moved on to search another area. As night fell, the situation became even more dangerous. The cartel soldiers had night vision equipment and were using trained tracking dogs to follow any scent trails left behind during her escape from the river. Maria could hear the dogs barking in the distance as they picked up her trail, getting closer with each passing hour. She made the difficult decision to enter the water again, using the river to mask her scent and throw off the tracking dogs. The current was still treacherous, but staying on land would mean certain capture within a few hours. Maria waded into the fast-flowing water and began working her way downstream, hoping to find a safe place to come ashore miles away from the search area. The second river crossing was even more harrowing than the first. Maria was already exhausted and hypothermic from her earlier immersion, and the cold water quickly sapped what little strength she had remaining. Several times she was nearly swept under by powerful currents or slammed against submerged rocks and fallen trees. She finally struggled out of the water just before dawn, barely conscious and shivering uncontrollably. Her lips were blue with cold and her fingers were so numb that she could barely grip her rifle. Maria knew she was suffering from severe hypothermia and would die within hours unless she could get warm and dry. Finding shelter became her immediate priority, more important even than avoiding enemy patrols. Maria discovered a small cave hidden behind a waterfall about half a kilometer from the river, invisible from any direction, unless someone knew exactly where to look. She crawled inside and used her emergency survival gear to start a small fire with dry wood she found deeper in the cave. Slowly, feeling returned to her hands and feet, as the warmth of the fire began to counteract the hypothermia. Maria stripped off her wet clothing and hung everything near the flames to dry, knowing that she would need dry gear if she hoped to survive another day in the jungle. Her rifle had been submerged, but seemed to be functioning properly after she cleaned and oiled all the moving parts. The cave provided excellent concealment, but it also trapped her in a single location where she could easily be cornered if discovered. Maria could hear helicopters flying search patterns overhead and vehicles moving along jungle roads as the cartel expanded their hunt for the infiltration team. Every few hours, patrol groups passed near her hiding place, sometimes close enough that she could hear individual conversations. On the second day, Maria's situation became critical. Her food supplies were nearly exhausted, and she was showing signs of dehydration despite having access to water from the stream that fed the waterfall. More importantly, infection was beginning to set in around several cuts and scrapes she had suffered during her escape through the jungle. Without proper medical treatment, she would soon be too weak to continue evading capture. It was then that she heard the sound she had been praying for since the mission began to go wrong. The distinctive rotor noise of a Colombian Army helicopter was approaching from the north, flying low and slow as if searching for something specific. Maria grabbed her signal mirror from her survival kit and began flashing reflected sunlight toward the aircraft, hoping to attract the attention of any friendly forces. The helicopter changed course and began circling the area around her cave, obviously responding to her signal flashes. Maria emerged from concealment and waved frantically at the aircraft, identifying herself through hand signals that any military pilot would recognize. The helicopter pilot acknowledged her signals and began looking for a place to land in the dense forest. But the sound of the helicopter had also attracted enemy attention. Maria could see cartel soldiers running through the jungle toward her position, racing to capture or kill her before the rescue could be completed. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they would overrun her cave and cut off any chance of extraction. The helicopter pilot found a small clearing about 200 meters from Maria's position and began his approach for landing. At the same time, the first cartel soldiers appeared at the edge of the forest, opening fire on both Maria and the aircraft with automatic weapons. Bullets sparked off the helicopter's armored hull as the pilot fought to maintain control and complete the landing. Maria provided covering fire with her sniper rifle, picking off enemy soldiers who were trying to get close enough to use rocket-propelled grenades against the helicopter. Her accurate shooting bought precious seconds for the rescue aircraft to touch down and deploy soldiers who immediately established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The running firefight that followed was intense but brief. The helicopter crew included a squad of special operations soldiers who were equipped with superior weapons and training. They systematically eliminated the cartel forces while Maria ran across the clearing toward the aircraft, bullets whining through the air around her. She was less than 50 meters from safety when the sniper's bullet found her. The impact felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Maria looked down to see blood spreading across the front of her uniform, pumping out of a wound in her chest with each heartbeat. The bullet had struck just below her left collarbone, possibly penetrating her lung or heart. Maria could taste blood in her mouth and found it difficult to breathe as fluid began filling her chest cavity. She tried to crawl toward the helicopter, but her strength was fading rapidly as blood loss and shock began to take effect. 2 soldiers from the rescue team saw her fall and immediately rushed toward her position under heavy enemy fire. They reached Maria just as her vision began to blur and her legs gave out completely. One soldier applied pressure to her chest wound, while the other provided covering fire against the remaining cartel fighters. Maria could hear voices around her becoming distant and muffled as she drifted toward unconsciousness. The soldiers were shouting instructions about blood loss and medical evacuation, but their words seemed to be coming from very far away. She tried to tell them about the intelligence she had gathered on the cartel compound, but no sounds would come from her throat. The last thing she remembered was being lifted onto a stretcher and carried toward the helicopter at a dead run. Enemy bullets were still striking the ground around them, and she could see muzzle flashes in the jungle where cartel soldiers were making their final desperate attacks. Then everything went black as Maria Santos lost consciousness, her life hanging by a thread as the rescue helicopter lifted off and raced toward the nearest military hospital. The flight to the base hospital took 35 minutes. It seemed like hours to the medical personnel working frantically to keep Maria alive. Her blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and they had to insert multiple IV lines to replace the fluid she was losing from her chest wound. The helicopter medic worked constantly to clear blood from her airway and maintain her breathing until they could reach surgical facilities. Colonel Vargas was waiting at the hospital when the helicopter landed, along with the best trauma surgeons in the Colombian military medical system. Maria was rushed immediately into emergency surgery, where doctors worked for 6 hours to repair the damage caused by the sniper's bullet. The projectile had missed her heart by less than 2 centimeters, but had punctured her left lung and damaged several major blood vessels. For 3 days, Maria hovered between life and death in the intensive care unit. Her vital signs fluctuated wildly as her body fought to recover from massive blood loss and trauma. Captain Silver and the other members of her team maintained a constant vigil outside her room, waiting for news about whether their teammate and friend would survive. The intelligence Maria had gathered during the mission proved invaluable for planning the airstrike that destroyed the cartel compound. Her detailed observations enabled military pilots to target the facility's most important structures while avoiding defensive positions that could have shot down the attacking aircraft. The mission was ultimately successful, but the cost had been nearly losing one of Colombia's most skilled and dedicated soldiers. On the 4th day after surgery, Maria finally regained consciousness. Her first words were questions about whether the mission had been completed and if her teammates had made it home safely. The doctors had to restrain her physically when she tried to get out of bed to return to duty, explaining that she would need weeks of recovery before she could even think about military service. But even as Maria began the long process of healing from her wounds, she was already planning her return to active duty. The woman who had refused to quit when told that pretty girls belonged in kitchens was not about to let a bullet end her military career. She had survived the worst that enemy soldiers could throw at her, and she would emerge from this trial stronger and more determined than ever before. Recovery was the hardest battle Maria had ever fought. For someone accustomed to running 10 kilometers before breakfast and spending days moving through jungle terrain, being confined to a hospital bed felt like a special kind of torture. The bullet wound in her chest had healed, but her left lung still caused problems when she tried to breathe deeply. Physical therapy sessions left her exhausted and frustrated, struggling to perform simple exercises that would have been effortless before her injury. The military doctors were amazed by her survival. The sniper's bullet had entered her chest at an angle that should have been instantly fatal, missing her heart and major arteries by millimeters. A few degrees in either direction, and Maria would have died in that jungle clearing before the rescue team could reach her. Even with expert medical care, they had expected her to suffer permanent disability that would end her military career. But Maria Santos had never accepted other people's expectations about what she could or couldn't accomplish. While other patients in the rehabilitation ward complained about their exercises or asked for pain medication, she pushed herself through therapy sessions that left her sweating and shaking with exhaustion. When doctors told her to rest, she found ways to continue training using equipment they hadn't forbidden her to touch. Captain Silver visited her almost daily during the first month of recovery, bringing news from the Special Operations Unit and updates on mission developments. The airstrike on the cartel compound had been completely successful, destroying cocaine processing equipment worth millions of dollars and eliminating a major source of drugs flowing toward North America. Intelligence gathered from the operation had led to arrests throughout the trafficking network, crippling cartel operations across 3 countries. Maria's heroism during the mission had not gone unnoticed by senior military leadership. Colonel Vargas informed her that she was being recommended for Colombia's highest decoration for valor, and her story had attracted attention from military officials throughout South America. Several foreign armies had requested permission to interview her about her tactical innovations and survival techniques. But all the recognition in the world meant nothing to Maria if she couldn't return to active duty with her unit. The doctors remained pessimistic about her chances of passing the physical fitness requirements that special operations soldiers had to meet. Her lung capacity was still reduced, and she experienced chest pain during strenuous exercise that could be dangerous in combat situations. Maria refused to accept their medical assessments as final judgments. During her second month of recovery, she began supplementary training outside of official therapy sessions. Late at night, when the hospital corridors were empty, she climbed stairs to build cardiovascular endurance. She did push-ups and sit-ups in her room until her chest ached, then continued for 10 more repetitions. Every day she pushed her body a little further than medical professionals thought was safe or advisable. The breakthrough came during her 3rd month of rehabilitation. Maria had convinced the physical therapy staff to let her use the hospital's gymnasium during off-peak hours, arguing that she needed variety in her exercise routine to prevent boredom and depression. What she didn't tell them was that she was planning to attempt the full Special Operations fitness test, including running, climbing, and weapons handling requirements. On a Tuesday morning when the gymnasium was empty except for hospital maintenance staff, Maria set up a makeshift obstacle course using available equipment. She had memorized every component of the Special Operations physical fitness test, from the initial 2-mile run to the final marksmanship evaluation. If she could complete the entire sequence within regulation time limits, she would prove that her injury hadn't destroyed her military career. The running portion nearly broke her. Maria's lung capacity was still reduced from her chest injury, and she struggled to maintain the pace required for a passing score. Halfway through the 2nd mile, she was gasping for air and felt like her chest was on fire. But she kept running, drawing on the same determination that had carried her through jungle warfare and enemy pursuit. She finished the run with seconds to spare, then immediately moved on to the strength and agility components. Pull-ups were agony because they stressed the muscles around her healing wound, but Maria completed the required number plus 3 extra just to prove she could. The rope climbing exercise sent sharp pains through her chest, but she reached the top in regulation time and rappelled down with perfect technique. By the time she reached the final marksmanship test, Maria was exhausted and in considerable pain. Her hands were shaking from exertion and sweat was dripping into her eyes as she took position at the firing line. But when she looked through the rifle scope and centered her crosshairs on the target, everything else faded away. This was what she did better than anyone else in the Colombian army. Every shot found its mark. Maria's accuracy was flawless despite her physical condition, proving that her most important military skill had not been diminished by injury or extended recovery. When she finished the test and calculated her overall score, she realized she had not only passed the Special Operations requirements, but had achieved one of the highest scores recorded in recent years. Maria documented her unofficial fitness test with photographs and video recordings, then presented the evidence to Colonel Vargas during her next medical review. The colonel was astounded by what she had accomplished, but also concerned about the risks she had taken by pushing herself so hard without medical supervision. He ordered immediate official testing to verify her capabilities under controlled conditions. The official fitness evaluation took place 1 week later, supervised by military doctors and witnessed by senior officers who wanted to see if Maria's recovery was genuine. She repeated her previous performance, completing every component of the Special Operations test within regulation parameters. The medical staff could no longer argue that she was unfit for military duty when the evidence clearly showed otherwise. Colonel Vargas reinstated Maria to active duty status immediately, but with restrictions on the types of missions she could undertake. He assigned her to training duties initially, believing that she could contribute to military effectiveness by teaching her techniques to other soldiers while fully recovering from her injury. Maria accepted the assignment gracefully, understanding that she needed to rebuild trust in her capabilities before returning to frontline operations. Her first assignment as an instructor was teaching marksmanship to new recruits at the Army's training center outside Bogotá. Many of the young soldiers had heard stories about her combat exploits and were eager to learn from someone who had proven herself in actual battles. Maria found that she enjoyed teaching, particularly when she could help struggling students improve their accuracy and confidence. But teaching also revealed the extent to which combat had changed her. Maria found herself constantly scanning her surroundings for potential threats, positioning herself where she could quickly reach cover if necessary. Sudden noises made her reach instinctively for weapons that weren't there, and she had difficulty sleeping without checking and rechecking the security of her quarters. The military psychiatrist explained that she was experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, a common condition among soldiers who had survived life-threatening combat situations. He recommended counseling sessions and temporary medication to help her adjust to peacetime activities. Maria initially resisted, believing that mental health treatment was a sign of weakness, but eventually agreed when her symptoms began interfering with her teaching duties. Therapy sessions forced Maria to confront aspects of her military experience that she had been avoiding. She talked about the men she had killed during various combat operations, acknowledging for the first time that taking human lives had affected her more deeply than she wanted to admit. She discussed her fears about future missions and her concerns that her injury might make her a liability to her teammates. Gradually, the counseling sessions began to help. Maria learned techniques for managing her hypervigilance and controlling the flashbacks that had been disrupting her sleep. She started to understand that seeking help for psychological wounds was just as important as treating physical injuries, and that even the strongest soldiers needed support to recover from traumatic experiences. After 6 months of teaching duty, Maria felt ready to return to operational assignments. Her fitness evaluations consistently exceeded military requirements, and her marksmanship scores were better than ever. The chest pains that had plagued her early recovery had disappeared, and she could breathe normally even during strenuous exercise. Most importantly, she had regained the mental clarity and emotional stability necessary for high-stress combat situations. Colonel Vargas was initially reluctant to approve her return to dangerous missions, worried that she might suffer additional injuries that could end her career permanently. But Maria's performance during training exercises was so outstanding that he couldn't justify keeping her in instructor positions when she was clearly capable of contributing to active operations. Her first mission back with the Special Operations Unit was a reconnaissance assignment in the mountains near the Venezuelan border, where intelligence reports suggested that armed groups were smuggling weapons and contraband across the frontier. It was considered a relatively low-risk operation that would allow Maria to readjust to field conditions without facing the intense combat that had nearly killed her on the Amazon island. The mission went perfectly. Maria's skills as a scout and observer had been sharpened by her recovery experience, and she gathered intelligence that led to the arrest of a major smuggling ring. Her teammates, who had been worried about her capabilities after such a serious injury, quickly realized that she had returned to the unit stronger and more focused than before. Word of Maria's successful return to active duty spread throughout the Colombian military. Officers who had written her off as a casualty of war were forced to acknowledge that she had overcome injuries that would have ended most soldiers' careers. Her story became an inspiration for other wounded veterans who were struggling with their own recovery challenges. The mission that would define the final chapter of Maria's military career came in early 2021, when intelligence agencies identified a terrorist training camp operating in the remote mountains of southern Colombia. The facility was allegedly being used to train fighters for various armed groups, teaching bomb-making techniques and guerrilla warfare tactics that threatened civilian populations throughout the region. Satellite imagery showed a sophisticated compound hidden in dense cloud forest, complete with obstacle courses, firing ranges, and classroom buildings. The terrorist trainers were reportedly former soldiers from several countries who had been recruited to share their expertise with extremist organizations. Eliminating the training camp would significantly reduce the threat of terrorism throughout South America. The mission required a team capable of operating independently for extended periods in difficult terrain, gathering intelligence while remaining undetected by hostile forces. Maria's combination of reconnaissance skills, marksmanship ability, and jungle warfare experience made her the ideal candidate for the assignment. Colonel Vargas selected her to lead a 4-person team that would infiltrate the area and coordinate with air support to destroy the terrorist facility. Maria's team included Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become one of her closest friends during their service together, Lieutenant Torres, the explosives expert who had originally doubted her capabilities, and a new member, Corporal Mendez, a communications specialist who had requested assignment to Maria's unit specifically because of her reputation. They spent 3 weeks planning every aspect of the operation, studying topographical maps and weather patterns while rehearsing infiltration procedures. The terrorist camp was located in terrain that was even more challenging than the Amazon island where Maria had been wounded. Dense vegetation, steep mountain slopes, and frequent rainfall would make movement difficult and observation challenging. The insertion went smoothly, with the team parachuting into a remote valley under cover of darkness and immediately moving toward their objective. Maria felt completely comfortable leading soldiers through dangerous territory again, her confidence fully restored by months of successful missions since her return to active duty. The chest wound that had nearly ended her career was now just another scar that reminded her of what she had survived. They established their observation post on a ridge overlooking the terraced compound, concealed among thick vegetation that provided excellent camouflage while allowing clear fields of fire. Through her sniper scope, Maria could see instructors conducting training sessions with students from various countries, teaching techniques that could be used in attacks against innocent civilians. For 5 days, the team documented terrorist activities and identified key personnel who appeared to be senior instructors or coordinators. Maria's detailed observations would be crucial for targeting the most important elements of the training operation during the planned airstrike. She noted daily routines, security procedures, and the locations of weapons storage areas that would create secondary explosions when attacked. The airstrike was scheduled for dawn on the 6th day, time to catch the maximum number of terrorists in their barracks buildings when they would be most vulnerable. Maria's team would provide target designation and damage assessment, then evacuate through predetermined routes that would take them away from the strike zone before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Everything was proceeding according to plan when the unexpected happened. A patrol of terrorist fighters appeared on the ridge just 500 meters from Maria's observation post, obviously conducting a routine security sweep of the area around their compound. The patrol leader was using binoculars to scan the jungle systematically, and it was only a matter of time before he spotted signs of the military team's presence. Maria had seconds to make a decision that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. If she allowed the patrol to discover their position, the terrorists would be alerted and would either escape before the airstrike arrived or launch a coordinated attack against her team. But eliminating the patrol would also compromise their concealment and might trigger a larger response from the compound below. She chose to engage, knowing that the mission's success was more important than her team's safety. Maria's first shot dropped the patrol leader instantly, a bullet striking him center mass before he could raise an alarm. Her second and third shots eliminated 2 more terrorists before they could bring their weapons to bear, while Rodriguez and Torres engaged the remaining enemies with automatic weapons fire. The firefight was brief but intense, ending with all 6 patrol members eliminated before they could radio a warning to their base. But the sound of gunfire had carried across the valley, and Maria could see activity in the compound below as terrorists began responding to the threat. Armed fighters were emerging from buildings and taking defensive positions, obviously preparing for attack. The element of surprise had been lost, but the airstrike was already inbound and could not be recalled without compromising other aspects of the operation. Maria coordinated with the approaching aircraft, providing updated target information as the terrorists below scrambled to defend their facility. She watched through her scope as the first bombs struck the compound, creating massive explosions that destroyed buildings and eliminated dozens of enemy fighters. The strike was devastatingly effective, destroying the terrorist training camp and eliminating its threat to regional security. Maria's team had successfully completed one of the most important missions in recent Colombian military history, striking a significant blow against extremist organizations throughout South America. As they withdrew from the area and headed toward their extraction point, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having contributed to her country's security in such a meaningful way. The success of the terrorist camp mission marked the pinnacle of Maria's military career. She was promoted to the rank of captain and assigned to lead the entire Special Operations Unit, becoming the first woman to command such an elite formation in Colombian Army history. Her appointment was controversial initially, but her proven track record in combat quickly silenced any critics who questioned her qualifications. Under Maria's leadership, the Special Operations Unit achieved unprecedented success in counter-terrorism and counter-narcotics operations. She implemented new training procedures based on her own combat experience, emphasizing marksmanship, survival skills, and psychological preparation for high-stress situations. Soldiers from other South American countries began requesting assignment to her unit to learn her innovative tactics and techniques. Maria also became an advocate for expanding opportunities for women in combat roles throughout the military. She testified before congressional committees about the contributions female soldiers could make to national defense, using her own experience as evidence that gender was irrelevant when it came to military effectiveness. Her arguments helped change policies that had previously excluded women from certain assignments and career fields. By 2023, Captain Maria Santos had become one of the most decorated soldiers in Colombian Army history. She had received every major award for valor that her country could bestow, and her story had been featured in military journals around the world. Foreign armies sent observers to study her methods, and she was frequently invited to speak at international conferences about special operations tactics. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the inspiration she provided to other women who dreamed of military careers. Young girls throughout Colombia now knew that they could aspire to serve their country in combat roles, regardless of what anyone told them about where they belonged. Maria had proven that determination, skill, and courage were not limited by gender, and that barriers could be overcome through persistent effort and unwavering commitment. The woman who had been told that pretty girls belonged in kitchens had become a national hero and a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept artificial limitations. She had been shot, wounded, and written off as finished, but had returned stronger than ever to continue serving the country she loved. Maria Santos had truly refused to quit, and in doing so had changed not just her own life but the entire Colombian military. Her bleeding chest had healed, her fainting spell had passed, and she had emerged from both as an unstoppable warrior who would never again be underestimated by anyone who encountered her. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming a soldier had grown up to become a legend, inspiring generations of future warriors who would follow in her footsteps. Today, Captain Santos continues to serve with the same dedication and excellence that has characterized her entire military career. She remains one of Colombia's most capable special operations officers, always ready to deploy wherever her country needs her most. The scars on her chest serve as reminders of what she has survived and overcome, but they no longer define her limitations. Instead, they represent the strength that comes from refusing to give up when others expect you to quit. Maria Santos proved that true warriors are not measured by their physical strength or their gender, but by their willingness to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. She showed that a bleeding chest and a moment of unconsciousness were just temporary obstacles to be overcome, not permanent barriers to success. Her story continues to inspire soldiers throughout South America and beyond, demonstrating that the most important battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the limitations that others try to impose upon us. Maria Santos refused to quit, and in doing so became exactly what she had always dreamed of being: a warrior who would never be defeated by circumstances, injuries, or other people's expectations about what she could accomplish.